Okay, so I've been doing some thinking, and you know how I've always said I want to be cremated? Well, I finally started looking into what that actually means. And let me tell you, it's way more complicated than I thought.
I get that. I went through the same thing recently. I was like, yeah, cremation, simple. But then you start looking at all the options, and it's a whole world.
Right, like I always assumed cremation was just, you know, cremation. But there are all these different types of cremation services, each with its own quirks and costs and considerations.
It is pretty wild. We both know we want to be cremated. But neither of us had thought about the specifics. It's kind of like planning a wedding you never thought you'd have. All the different
I
choices.
know. So I figured we could chat about it, maybe help each other, and anyone listening
Yeah.
navigate this whole cremation landscape.
Sounds good to me. Where do we even start?
Well, let's begin with the basics. Cremation itself is the reduction of the body to bone fragments. Using extremely high heat, I was surprised to learn it gets up to 1800 degrees Fahrenheit.
That's hot enough to melt steel. It's amazing to think about the science behind it. And after that intense heat, what's left are those bone fragments, which are then processed into the cremains.
Right, and those are usually given back to the family in an urn or some other container. But before we even get to that, there's the whole question of the type of cremation service you want. The simplest and usually most affordable is direct cremation.
Direct cremation is becoming really popular. It's basically just the cremation itself, without any funeral or memorial service attached.
Makes sense for folks who want to keep it simple and inexpensive. My uncle went that route. He was a private guy who didn't want a big fuss. His family had a gathering later at his favorite fishing spot, which felt much more him than a somber funeral.
I can see the appeal of that. It gives you the flexibility to have a memorial or celebration of life on your own terms, whenever and wherever feels right.
Totally. But if you do want a service, there are options for that too, like cremation with a memorial service, which happens after the cremation has taken place.
That's a good option if you want to have a gathering to honor the person, but prefer it to be less formal than a traditional funeral. You can hold it anywhere. A funeral home, a park, someone's home, really anywhere that has meaning.
And because the cremation is already done, you have more flexibility with timing. Maybe you want to wait until family members can travel, or until the weather's nice enough for an outdoor gathering.
You know, it makes me think about the emotional aspect of all this. Having time to plan a truly personal memorial could be really helpful for the grieving process. You're not rushed into a traditional funeral format.
That's a really good point. I hadn't thought about it that way. It's not just about the logistics. It's about finding a way to say goodbye that feels right for everyone.
Of course. There's also the option of cremation with a traditional funeral service.
So a regular funeral
Yeah.
with the body present, and then the cremation happens afterward.
Yep. It allows people to have that traditional viewing and ceremony, but still choose cremation.
It's kind of like getting the best of both worlds, isn't it? You can honor those traditions, but still have your final wishes carried out.
Speaking of honoring traditions, there's also cremation with a graveside service, which tends to be a shorter service held at a cemetery.
I'm guessing that's a nice option for people who want a more intimate and traditional setting, but still prefer cremation to burial.
It is. It allows for that moment of closure at the gravesite, either before or after the cremation. And then there's the option that has me really intrigued, green cremation.
Oh yeah, tell me more about that. I've heard a little about it.
Yeah.
But I'm fascinated by the idea of an eco-friendly option.
Well, instead of using fire, green cremation, also called alkaline hydrolysis, uses water and alkaline chemicals to break down the body.
So it's gentler on the environment?
Much gentler, uses way less energy, and produces significantly fewer emissions than traditional cremation.
It's amazing how science is finding these alternatives.
Yeah.
Even in something like death care, it makes you think about the impact of our choices, even after we're gone.
It really does. But here's something that really blew my mind. Some places actually let you witness the cremation.
Whoa, hold on. Witness it. Like actually be there while it's happening. No way, that's too much for me.
I know, right? It's definitely not for everyone, but it's an option for those who feel it might offer closure or a deeper connection to the process.
I guess everyone grieves differently. And some people might find that helpful. It's just not for me. So, wow, that's a lot to think about. And we haven't even touched on things like choosing an urn, deciding what to do with the cremains.
And all of the factors that go into choosing a service in the first place. Budget, personal preferences, religious beliefs, environmental concerns, even just the timing and location. It's a lot.
Which of those factors are most important to you?
For me, I'm leaning towards something simple, environmentally conscious, and most importantly, something that truly reflects the person's life.
I think I'm right there with you. It's about making choices that feel meaningful, both for the person who's passed and for those left behind.
It's interesting, you know. We spend so much time planning for life events, weddings, graduations, vacations, but we often avoid planning for the one event that's guaranteed to happen to all of us.
I know. It's like we're trying to outsmart the inevitable. But talking about it now, while we're both healthy and thinking clearly, take some of the pressure off later. And honestly, it's kind of fascinating to explore all the different ways we can approach this final chapter.
It is fascinating, and it's not just about us. Thinking about our wishes ahead of time is a gift we can give our loved ones. They won't have to guess what we would have wanted during an already difficult time.
That's so true. It's one less burden for them to carry. It's funny, when I started looking into all of this, I thought it would be morbid or depressing, but it's actually been kind of freeing. Like taking control of this aspect of life,
Yeah.
even though it's about death, is oddly empowering.
I think it's empowering for our families as well. They know they're honoring our wishes, and that can bring them a sense of peace.
Definitely. Okay, so we've covered the different types of cremation services, but what about the actual cremation process? I have to admit, I'm a little curious and a little scared about what happens in the crematorium.
It's understandable to feel that way. It's a pretty intense process. The body is placed in a special chamber called a retort, where the temperature gets cranked up to that 1800 degrees we were talking about.
And that reduces everything to those bone fragments, which are then further processed into the fine ash we think of as cremains.
That's right. It's a pretty efficient process, honestly. It takes a couple of hours. And then the cremains are cooled and carefully collected.
What about things like pacemakers or artificial joints? I imagine those would be an issue in that kind of heat.
You're right. They can be. Funeral homes remove those beforehand, as well as any jewelry or personal items that aren't meant to be cremated with the body.
It's good to know they handle all those details. So once the cremation is done and we have the cremains, what happens next? I mean, what are the options for what to do with them?
The possibilities are almost endless. The traditional route is to keep the cremains in an urn, which can be displayed at home, placed in a columbarium, or even buried in a cemetery.
I've seen some beautiful urns, actually. There's some really unique and artistic ones out there, made from all sorts of materials. Some are even biodegradable, which I think is a nice touch if you're going for an eco-friendly approach.
Biodegradable urns are a great option. They can be buried or even placed in water, where they naturally decompose over time.
Speaking of water, I've heard of people scattering ashes at sea. That always seems so romantic and peaceful.
Scattering ashes is definitely a popular choice. People choose places that were meaningful to the deceased. A favorite beach, a hiking trail, even a sports stadium.
Isn't there a whole thing about legality and permits for scattering ashes in certain places?
There can be. It's definitely a good idea to check local regulations before you scatter ashes anywhere, especially on public land or in waterways. You don't want to run afoul of the law while you're trying to have a meaningful memorial.
Good point. I also remember reading about companies that can turn ashes into diamonds or incorporate them into coral reefs.
Those options are becoming increasingly popular, especially for people who want something a little different from a traditional urn.
It's amazing how creative people are getting with memorialization these days. You can have ashes turned into glass art, jewelry, even planted with a tree.
That's what I love about cremation. It allows for so much flexibility and personalization. You can really honor someone's life in a way that feels authentic and meaningful.
So if you had to choose right now, what would you do with your cremains?
Ooh, that's a tough one. I'm drawn to the idea of having them turned into something beautiful and lasting, like a piece of glass art or a tree. What about you?
A piece of glass art or a tree. That's beautiful. Honestly, I'm still wrestling with that decision. Part of me likes the idea of scattering my ashes somewhere meaningful, but then I also think about the people left behind and wonder if they'd rather have a physical place to visit, like an urn at a columbarium.
I see both sides. Scattering feels very free-spirited, but having a designated spot can provide comfort and a focal point for remembrance. Maybe it's about finding a balance, like scattering some ashes and keeping some in an urn or having them turned into something special.
That's a good idea. It's like you can honor different aspects of the person's life and cater to different needs. This whole conversation has been so helpful. I feel much less intimidated by the whole cremation thing now.
Me too. It's been good to talk through all the options and realize that there's no right or wrong way to do this. It's all about personal preference and finding what feels right for you and your loved ones.
And hey, maybe our tastes will change over time. Who knows? In a few years,
Yeah.
we might both be clamoring to have our ashes launched into space or something.
Now that would be a story to tell. But seriously, the important thing is that we've started the conversation, and hopefully we've encouraged others to do the same.
I hope so. Death is a part of life, and talking about it openly, even planning for it, can help us approach it with more peace and understanding.
Couldn't agree more. So for anyone listening who might be considering cremation, don't be afraid to explore all the possibilities. Talk to your loved ones, do your research, and make choices that feel authentic to you.
And if this conversation has sparked any thoughts or questions, please reach out to us. We'd love to hear your perspectives. Thanks for joining us on this journey through the world of cremation. Until next time.